Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the IAS Distinguished Lecture. My name is Ye Chi, Professor of Public Policy Division and the Director for the Institute of Public Policy. Right after this lecture, there will be a dialogue between the speaker and our own President, Professor Wei Xu, and followed by a conversation and reception for all of us here in the audience. So now I take a great pleasure and a distinct honor to introduce the speaker today. John Sexton is the President Emeritus, New York University, the Dean Emeritus of NYU Law School, and the Benjamin Butler Professor of Law, with amazing leadership in the first 15 years of the century. He elevated NYU to a world-renowned, the top research university in the world, and the first global network university, including the port campuses in Abu Dhabi and Shanghai. And he's a past chairman of American Council on Education, the Commission on Independent Colleges and Universities, the New York Academy of Sciences, and the past president of Association of American Law Schools. And he also served as a chairman of the board of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and chairman of Federal Reserve Systems Council of Chairs. In his earlier career, I love this the most, he was named the outstanding high school debate coach of the last 50 years. And 5 years ago, his book, Baseball as a Road to God, Seeing Beyond the Game, was a New York Times bestseller. And today, and he'll be sharing with us a highly anticipated another bestseller, and just published last month by Yale University Press, with the title, Standing for a Reason, The University in a Dogmatic Age. And his title today is Challenges Facing American Universities Today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor John Sexton.
Thank you all for being here. I know how busy each of you is, and I really do appreciate your coming out. It shows a remarkably positive virtue about the culture here. We were talking about this earlier today. There's this kind of a deference to those of us who have embraced the life of the mind that exists here, which is rarer and rarer and rarer and rarer in the world. That's much to your advantage, and it's lamentable about the places in the world where it's not the case. And that'll be a little bit of the theme of what I have to say to you today. So I have to first of all ask the magnificent Hung Xiao to stand. Please just stand. So Hung Xiao is my colleague and from NYU Shanghai, now helping with the enterprise here. And she volunteered as she saw my latest book developing, this book that is out just now, less than a month in the United States. She volunteered to translate it into Chinese, and she's completed that task now. So to the extent that you're interested in these ideas, you can test your bilingualism and her capacity to translate and send me emails as to whether you feel that she captured both the letter and then after today, the spirit of what is in this book. I'm not going to synopsize the book for you, and I'm a bit intimidated both by the presence of some extremely distinguished thinkers here in the room and by the fact that this has been billed as a lecture. So to the extent that you have any familiarity with me, or to the extent you've spoken, if you're a student here, to any of my students, because throughout my time as dean and my time as president of the university, which was 14 years as dean and 14 years as president, so for that full 28-year period, I continued to teach a full faculty schedule. So not an academic year went by that I didn't teach at least 4 courses frequently on more than one continent, given the nature of NYU, which we'll speak about today. And I think that tells you right at the top the basic viewpoint which animates my writing, and that is that I was put on earth to be a teacher. And I understood teaching and the life of the mind and research and writing to be the highest calling to which a human being could be privileged to respond. And next year will be my 60th year as a teacher formally in a classroom, in part because, as preposterous as it sounds, I was given my first classroom when I was younger than most, probably all of the students in the room. I was 17 years old when I was allowed to walk into a high school classroom where some of my students were older than I was. And it began this extraordinary life which brings me to you today. And having grown up, as you probably can hear if you're conversant in American accents, this, if you want to take out your iPhones and record it for future use, this is a pure Brooklyn accent. So I come to you from the center of the world, Brooklyn, New York, the place where every American wishes he or she could be. Okay, and I was the product of the streets. I am the product of the streets of Brooklyn. And if you can imagine that world, it's an interesting predicate for what we'll talk about today, because the world in which I grew up was bounded by a few square miles. Even Manhattan, which was across the bridge and is the New York City of the movies and of television, and perhaps the New York City, if you haven't visited New York, that you think is New York. Going to Manhattan was something that we didn't do. We called it going to the city. It was as if you were visiting another country. We didn't have the money or even the wisdom, because there were great things in Manhattan, it turned out. There were free concerts. You didn't need money for them. There were museums which were free, great museums, some of the great in the world. But none of that was part of my early experience. And then there entered my life, and I'm going to tell you about this man who was a teacher, and who was a teacher for his entire life. He died about 10 years ago, in his mid-80s. He never married. His life was his teaching. His life was his students. He taught at this high school in Brooklyn, which was for young men, all boys, run by an order of Catholic priests, the Jesuits, great educators. He was not a Jesuit, but that school has not existed since 1972. Closed its doors in 1972. So it was getting close to 50 years ago. And yet, just last month, as in every April, about 80% of the living graduates of that school gathered together at another high school in New York City, run by the same group of priests, and we go to Mass together, and then we go across to the cafeteria of this other high school, and we have dinner together. It's a simple dinner, not a fancy dinner, and we invite back all of our living teachers, and we celebrate that school. Now think of that. Think of the power of that educational institution if nearly 50 years later we're still gathering together in its honor. And we actually donate money to that school. It doesn't exist. But we all donate money to the school, and the money is used to give scholarships, financial aid, to students who attend other schools run by that order of priests in the name not of us, but in the name of the school. So I want to tell you about this man, because if you were to go to the campus of NYU Shanghai or to the campus of NYU Abu Dhabi, not so much NYU New York, which is just vast. I mean, NYU in New York is huge. About 65,000 students, about 7,000 faculty. And like New York City, it's hard to see. You know, we're not like Columbia. Columbia, the other great university in New York, has a beautiful campus and that has a lot of green grass, and you can lie there in the sun and so forth. I used to say when I first became president of New York, there's no grass on the NYU campus. Then I realized, for those of you that are good in English idiom, that was a double entendre, because grass is used by the students to refer to marijuana. And there is grass in that sense on the NYU campus. But so I started saying there's no blades of grass on the NYU campus. So NYU is kind of, it's ecosystematic with the city of New York. You can walk out of an NYU building and not see an NYU building, even though we have more buildings than any other institution in New York except for the government. We have about 280 buildings, but they're not all next to each other, and you have to walk through. So we like to say that when you walk out of an NYU building, you're in New York. New York is our campus. You step on sidewalk, not blades of grass. And we refer to Columbia as a gated community. So not necessarily in the big, vast expanse of NYU New York, but in NYU Shanghai or NYU Abu Dhabi, if you went up to any student, and probably most faculty members, and you said, whose idea was this? They would say, Charlie. Because they all know Charlie. Now, who was Charlie? So Charlie was this high school teacher. And you have to put your mind's eye back. This is virtually impossible for the students in the room. But put your mind's eye back to, I entered this high school in 1955. So it's a long time ago. To give you some cultural markers, okay, because I am a Catholic, a Roman Catholic. That's Pope Francis. Okay, I am a religious person. And then I was a Catholic. And for Catholics, this was before a very, very important cultural marker that I'll discuss with you, that I think is important to you here. And it's certainly important to NYU, even though New York University is a private university. It's not public. People think because it says New York, it's public. No, it's a private university, but it's a secular university. It's not a religious university, right? But what happened at NYU from 2001 on, the 15 years that were referred to very generously in the introduction, what happened was very much a product of what happened to Catholicism in the 5 years that I was in college, not high school, not with Charlie in high school, but in college, from 1959 to 1963. Okay, those 4 years were 4 of the 5 years of a cultural event in Catholicism called the Second Vatican Council. So just put that down as a cultural marker for a moment. And there was a great pope. So the leader of the Catholic Church is called the Pope. And the Pope at that time was a man called John the 23rd, Pope John the 23rd. He was only Pope for 5 years, okay, but he had a tremendous cultural influence on young people like me. So now back 1955, so it's before the Vatican Council, it's before John Kennedy has been elected President of the United States. Before John Kennedy was elected President of the United States, we Catholics did not think a Catholic could be elected President of the United States. In the same way as before Barack Obama, blacks didn't think that a black could be elected President of the United States. Or before Hillary Clinton, women didn't think a woman could be elected President of the United States. Oh, wait a minute. We'll reserve that for the questioning. I've still failed to recognize the fact that she is not our president. I just want you to know that. So I'm trying to paint, especially for the students, a sense of how the premises of a world can change in your lifetime. You know, if you're in East Germany and the wall comes down, okay, these are moments that just open a world in ways. Now, are you prepared for it? Do you notice it? What do you do with it if you do? These are some of the great questions of the way a life spells out. So now we're back at 1955, and here I am in this high school for boys, all essentially Brooklyn street kids like me. And into this place comes this man, Charlie. He was only in his early 30s. He had just gotten his PhD from Columbia in English. And in he walked in, and he was noticeable. So visually, you have Kentucky Fried Chicken here. So you know Colonel Sanders on the box of Kentucky Fried Chicken? You know, the white hair and the white beard and everything. That's the way Charlie looked in his 30s. Okay, he had premature white hair, he had a premature beard, and he was a big man. He was a big man, and he had a deep voice. Somebody said about Charlie later in his life that he had the body of Orson Welles, who was an old-time actor with a big body, the body of Orson Welles, the voice of James Earl Jones, and the soul of St. Francis of Assisi. And here he walked in, and he would walk the halls, and you noticed him because he had this, whenever he spoke, you couldn't avoid hearing him, and he had that image, and suddenly, because we weren't allowed to choose our subjects in high school, suddenly there appeared on the schedule of 12 of us, 8 to 9 in the morning, 5 days a week, for what turned out to be all 4 years of high school. Freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior year, a course that was just called Charlie. And it was that the people that ran the school, they knew they had something special in him, but they didn't know what it was or how to use it. So they took 12 of us. How we were selected, we don't know. And for 12 years, we had this kind of parallel education. And I remember when he walked into the room. Now in those days, and I don't know what the state is in Hong Kong now, but I assume that this is far more progressive than New York and Brooklyn were in those days. In those days, and we're in this, you know, the very conservative kind of Catholic background, there was no such thing as sex education. And you didn't get it from your parents, and you never saw any amorous activity going on, because people didn't do that in those days. You know, parents had twin beds. And the only education you got in this were from the older boys that had been left back. You know, so it wasn't from the brightest bulb in the box. And Charlie walked in, I remember as if it were yesterday, the first words he said to us. He looked out at us and he said, "Boys, on the first date." And all of us, afterwards when we checked notes, we all had the same reaction. Maybe this is it. Maybe they're going to tell us this is sex ed. We've all been waiting, you know, because we're all kind of 12 or 13 years old. We're freshmen in high school. Boys, on the first date, find out her IQ. Beauty fades, but the need for conversation never does. That's classic Charlie. Think of how important that lesson is. Beauty fades, but the need for conversation never does as you find your life partner. So there he was saying that on the first date. And then he started with the cave paintings at Altamara, 10,000 BC, and percussion music. And he worked up over 4 years through the centuries. This was before anybody ever used the word interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary like that. You know, the disciplines were in narrow silos. And he worked up through the centuries doing simultaneously history, literature, art, and music. And just to give you one vignette so that you get a feel for him, because he's pivotal to this story, as you'll find out. We had gotten to the Old Kingdom in Egypt, and we had read the Book of the Dead, and we had read the history of the Old Kingdom, and we had read the Shakespearean play, Antony and Cleopatra, and we're listening to zither music. And he's got on the wall, he had slides, and he would have on the wall, the various art, and he's got the pyramids of Giza there. And he says to us, boys, you will never see these pyramids because you can't drive to them. Because we were poor kids. We couldn't afford to get on a plane or a boat and go to Egypt and so forth. You can't drive there. He knew we could get in a car and drive. So he said, boys, there are pyramids south of here. He's talking about Mexico. Built by a great civilization. And then he says, this will resonate in Hong Kong, you just haven't heard of these pyramids because the goddamn British didn't rob these pyramids for their museums. So right away he's talking about Eurocentrism and, right? This is 1955 he's doing this. I mean, think of that for a moment, and think of, so he began to prepare us. We didn't know it, maybe he didn't know it, for expanding our minds. He was the first person that took me to Manhattan. First time I ever went to a restaurant, he piled 19 of us in his car. 19. I was one of the 5 guys in the trunk. And we drove over to Greenwich Village, ironically, where NYU is, and he took us to a restaurant called Felix's. It was an Italian restaurant. It doesn't exist anymore, where the waiters sang opera between serving courses. And when I went to my second restaurant and the waiters weren't singing, I went, what's the matter with this place, I didn't know Felix's was unusual. So, and he took us to the concerts and the museums, and he began, and he had a phrase which, again, if you went to Shanghai or if you went to Abu Dhabi, and to a certain extent even in New York for the time that I was president, and you said, what's the motto of NYU? This would be the motto. In fact, when I stepped down, the students gave me a huge celebration, and they had a playbill for it, and this was the title of the play. Play another octave of the piano. Play another octave of the piano. If there are notes you haven't touched, reach out and touch them. If there's a food you haven't tasted, if there's a music you haven't heard, if there's a book you haven't read, if there's a place you can get to that you haven't been, if there's a kind of person you've never met before, view that as a great gift. Play another octave of the piano. These are gifts of creation. Reach out and expand. And that essentially, if you want to understand what happened at NYU over the last 15 years, it can be understood very easily in 2 simple ways. Number one, it's a metaphor for New York City. That was something we came to realize in 2001. We frankly felt a little bit inferior to Columbia because they had their beautiful gated campus, and we had nothing. Okay? Then a friend of mine who was trying to get the Olympics to come to New York said to me, John, New York City is the first city in the world that has a neighborhood for every country in the world inhabited by people that were born in that country. And you could just get on the subway and go out and hear the music and taste the food and hear the language. But you know what the interesting thing was? If you asked the people in that neighborhood, what are you? They would say, I'm a New Yorker. Okay? I might be an Irish American or a Chinese American, but I'm a New Yorker. And I've got the old food, and I've got the old music, and I can maybe speak the old language, but I'm a New Yorker. And this was, now I'm coming back to the Vatican Council, this was the movie I had seen theologically in my church. Now, back to that high school. I actually tell this story in the book. Some of the professors and leaders that are here will know a name I'm going to use now because he was a hero in American politics in the 1960s. He was a priest, a Jesuit priest, and he and his brother were leaders of the anti-war movement. So you've heard of Martin Luther King. He was a leader in the 60s of the civil rights movement. Daniel Berrigan, Berrigan, you could Google him and you'll find he was a leader of the anti-war movement. Now, Danny Berrigan, that was in the 60s, Danny Berrigan was my teacher in the 50s at this high school. So I tell you what he did later so you don't think this is some backward-looking, conservative, retrogressive person. This was a radical progressive. And in a classroom in which I was a student in the 1950s, he wrote on the blackboard 4 Latin words: extra ecclesia nulla salus. Extra ecclesia nulla salus. Outside the church, he meant the Catholic Church, there's no salvation, no heaven. And I went up to him after class and I said, Father Berrigan, does that mean that my best friend, Jerry Epstein, who's Jewish, can't go to heaven? And Danny Berrigan said to me, if you don't baptize him, he will not go to heaven. Now think about that for a second, okay? And by the way, I'm singling out my religion and a hero of my religion, but every single religion and every single ideology has this about them. They are the one true way. So I'm using a metaphor here, ladies and gentlemen. You apply it as you wish. But my book is one big metaphor. Okay? And it starts off with that moment in that classroom, the same school that Charlie inhabited. In the same year, Charlie said to us, boys, on the first date, find out her IQ. Okay? Danny Berrigan said, outside the church, there's no salvation. Now, the most extraordinary person I ever met, a woman who miraculously I was able to persuade to marry me, a woman who still exists in my life as my heroine and as a person I try to be worthy of every day, notwithstanding the fact that she moved from this earth 12 years ago very suddenly, very, very, in an instant. She wasn't sick. She just died of one of these aneurysms. But she's still present in my life. She was Jewish. And we've raised our children Jewish and our grandchildren Jewish. It's impossible that she doesn't have a higher place in whatever afterlife there is, if there is one, than I do. But Danny Berrigan said, unless you baptize Jerry Epstein. So this is a virulent, aggressive, triumphalist dogmatism. Now, theologically, a process started with the Vatican Council. And I've witnessed it because my first doctorate, I have a doctorate in law, obviously, because I was dean of the law school. I'm now a law professor. But my first doctorate's in religion. Okay? And I got my doctorate in religion while the Vatican Council was going on, under the teaching of John the 23rd and of a great Jesuit philosopher. If you haven't read him, he's noted in my book, and you should get some of his philosophy to read. Teilhard de Chardin, who talked about the planetization, not globalization, the planetization of the world, and what the consequences for that were, about wishing for a better society worldwide, which is a worldwide version of New York City, a community of communities, where people say, I'm human, and bounds of theology or nationalism or ideology don't separate us. Okay, this was the vision that Charlie had that came to me in this period. Okay, and you know what? 60 years after Danny Berrigan made that statement, I could be in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican with the leaders of 25 faith traditions in a grand conversation about how each of us understood our own faith better by seeing the greatness of humanity and transcendence and meaning of life through the eyes of the other 24. and how that was the beginning of a process of dialogue, real dialogue, where you started with that process. How do these others see the world? Without dismissing them or feeling they're inferior, they're just different. They're coming from a different place. And then how do they see me? And then how can I learn from that? In this the word for it that we were taught in theology was ecumenism. Ecumenism. So you start with this triumphal dogmatism. I've got the truth, no one else does. And the most important thing humans can think of, that is eternal life and salvation is tied up with my truth. Too bad about you. To this world of ecumenism, which 60 years later, the arc of progress has happened. And now, of course, Jerry Epstein is going to go. But he's going to go through a different path from me. And of course, all good people are going to go. And most people are good people. So it's a whole different turn theologically. And I've seen that happen and participated in it in over 60 years. Now, the interesting predicate of my book and the opening quarter of it, essentially, is to trace that, but then say, interestingly enough, our politics has gone in the opposite direction. So in 1956, my father was the leading political figure in Brooklyn. But he worked with people from all the political parties to get the garbage picked up and the snow removed and the people educated and fed and employed and so forth. And you know, we didn't, and I'm talking about my country, but clearly this is not isolated to the United States. This is a phenomenon we see rifing through the world. Okay, and you'll decide yourself the extent to which it's applicable in your context. I'm not expert on that and wouldn't claim to be, but it certainly is not unique to the United States, because 60 years later, it's as if our political views were revealed. They're not reasoned, they're revealed. The same way the resurrection of Christ or the virgin birth were revealed to me, and I couldn't discuss that with Jerry Epstein because he didn't have the revelation, right? He didn't have the gift of my dogmatism. Now we have political dogmatism. Call it secular dogmatism, okay? Because it's not theological, but it's equally virulent. And in American politics, it's quite amazing that you can't have a conversation. You cannot have a conversation. People stop the conversation. It's at the slogan level. The question is it possible to think that we in the United States and worldwide can get out of this secular dogmatism to a secular version of ecumenism? Because this is certainly a stated axiom. In America, to give you the data, this is amazing data. Just listen to this number. It's so fascinating when I found this. Americans told pollsters in 1956, when Danny Berrigan made that statement, 3% of Americans told pollsters that they would be upset if somebody in their family married somebody from the other political party. 3%. Today, that number is 40%. 40% of Americans would be upset if somebody in their family married somebody from the other political party. By the way, that's higher than race, it's higher than religion, it's higher than ethnicity. It is the number one thing that white Americans would rather have a member of their family marry a black than marry a Democrat, marry a Republican. I mean, think about that. Yeah, and America, by the way, has a problem with race. I don't know if you've heard of it. We got a problem with race. But we got a bigger problem with this secular dogmatism. So my argument is that universities are perhaps the last best chance to introduce a notion of secular ecumenism and provide an antidote to this secular dogmatism. Now, I thought, it's interesting it was mentioned that I come from the world of competitive debate. Because that's, for the first time in my life, as I move on to this part of my book, I describe what competitive debate is. Now, some of you have been in things like Model UN or versions of debate. I'm going to describe debate the way we did it. So the way I did it as a participant for my 4 years of high school, and then the way for 15 years, because I ended up organizing my life around working with those high school kids that I started working with as a freshman. And for 15 years, I worked with a group of young women. The school I went to was all young women. So I was teaching not only students that were older than me, but young women that were older than me. And they managed, because they had a teacher that believed in them and didn't think there were any limitations on them, to dominate high school debate in the United States for those 15 years. They won the national championship 5 times, and every one of them went to college on a debate scholarship, and they went on to become the presidents of universities and lawyers and doctors and teachers. So they're all like my daughters. But this is the way we did it. And think about these things in the context of what I've just outlined, which is this secular dogmatism and the lack of real dialogue in political discourse. You know, just your revelation, my revelation. You say what you believe, I say what I believe. The climate change is a problem. Climate change is fake news. You know, end of conversation. Okay? And so think about this. Number one, we had the same topic for the entire year. So, you know, resolve that there should be universal service for all citizens, or resolve that the United Nations should be significantly strengthened, or resolve there should be universal health care for all. You know, whatever the topic was, it was the topic for the whole year. So you might be a champion in a tournament that was held in October, but if you didn't keep reading and getting deeper into the subject and advance your thinking and advance your arguments, you were toast by November. Okay, because they'll call you all these driven, competitive people that they're doing more and more reading and getting more and more deeply into it, you know. So that was number one, same topic for the whole year. Second, in a debate, there are 2 speakers on each side. Okay, first affirmative gets up, states his or her argument. First negative gets up and responds to that. And there's a judge in the back of the room with a chart, is drawing lines. What did you answer? What did you not answer? Did you answer it adequately or not? Then the second affirmative gets up, answers what the previous speaker said. The argument's getting deeper. Then the second negative gets up. That goes on 8 times. So by the time you're done, the argument has been deepened in the debate 8 times. Next, and this is like the coolest thing about it, you don't know which side you're on until the coin is flipped. So you got to be prepared on both sides. And fourth and finally, the real hallmark of a champion debater, too few people realize this. This was the difference between very good debaters and champion debaters. The real hallmark of a champion debater was that they were very, very good listeners. Because if you didn't listen to the nuance in your opponent's argument, remember that judge is in the back of the room and he or she is following the arguments carefully. If you didn't listen, you couldn't answer it. Now, I would submit to you that that is a kind of prototypical explanation of what a university is. Right? No premises above reproach, a continual, iterative, disciplined conversation, civilly engaged in, where all that counts is the power of the thought extended and extended and extended and deepened and deepened and deepened. And no final truth, no truth that then gets put into big bold letters. If you don't believe this, you can't go to heaven. All right? So I then go on, and this begins to get us to some of the challenges facing American universities, to say, are American universities Are American universities moving toward this ideal or away from it? And it's been very, very interesting because as part of rolling out the book, there's something in the United States called National Public Radio. And one really cool way, if you have a book that... Now, by the way, my previous book, Baseball is a Road to God, had a trade publisher. Penguin Books is one of the big trade publishers. They make, profits selling books and so forth. And Baseball is a Road to God, which is a book that means a lot to me because it's on spirituality. It's on that which is outside the ken of universities, but is important to the life of humans. We could talk about that if you want in the Q&A. But Penguin wanted to do Standing for Reason as well. And I said, no. I want to have a university press. I want to pick the university press that has a reputation for the best books on higher education. I want a university press because they don't publish it unless it's peer-reviewed behind a curtain. They don't know who wrote it, and they have 5 reviewers. And because everything in the book is footnoted. Because I knew some of the things I was going to say were against the conventional wisdom. And I didn't want people to be able to dismiss them as being uncorroborated. So that's why I went with the university press on this, and so also with the Chinese edition. So as I have done National Public Radio, it's interesting. You sit in your office on the phone, or you even sit at home on the phone, depending on the time of the day, and you're on 300 radio stations throughout the United States. And at least the format that the 4 or 5 shows that I've done have been is you're on for an hour. So the whole discussion is about the book for an hour. And the host will ask you questions. And the host on NPR, unlike some media hosts, has actually read the book. And they ask you intelligent questions. But then people can call in from anywhere in the country. And what's been amazing to me is the stranglehold in thinking about universities that a conventional wisdom has on the people of the United States. And if I were to summarize it to you in a word or two, it would be the devaluation of thought and education. This is a phenomenon that is spreading in the United States. So the first call I got on the very first show was, we all confess that your problem, as you stated, about the secular dogmatism is accurate, but universities are the last place that I would turn for the solution because they're all owned by the radical left. But this is deep in, and then they would use the example of speakers, because these make the headlines in the papers in the United States, being expelled from campus. And I would say, time out. Let me give you the data. Not just tens of thousands, but hundreds of thousands of speakers come to American campuses every year. External speakers come in. There are organizations, left and right, that monitor the expulsion of speakers. Last year, the total number, if you put together left and right, of speakers expelled from American campuses was 36, down from 48 the year before, out of hundreds of thousands that come. I said, but most of the conversation on campuses isn't an external speaker coming in. It's not me here today. It's the conversation among you people, day in and day out, in the classroom, out of the classroom, and so forth. And let me tell you about last week's faculty meeting at the law school at NYU, which you would probably think was a bastion of the left, but the law faculty at NYU has a greater ideological spread than does the Supreme Court of the United States. And that's what we're talking about there, Ruth Ginsburg to Clarence Thomas. And yet we have scholarly representatives, and the dialogue that goes on and is real. So in any case, there is this kind of conventional wisdom attack, even on the proposition that higher education is worthwhile. There are leaders in the United States that, put aside Trump. Trump is nonsensical because to talk about him is to pretend he thinks. So he doesn't value knowledge or expertise, and says that. He says, I don't need the generals. I know more. My gut. Forget the trade negotiations. My gut. And Kim likes me. And this is the guidance of his policy. Okay, it's kind of orgasmic. Okay, but so I'm not talking about him. Okay, but I'm talking about the zeitgeist in the United States is a devaluation of thought. And you would expect that if slogan, even what we call as presidential debates, you give your slogans, I give my slogans, you repeat your slogans, they're not like the debate I just outlined to you. And if you begin to get into nuance and complexity in an issue, you're going to lose your audience. Now, I got news for you. What do we do at universities? We do nuance and complexity. So this is a huge challenge externally. But then there are internal challenges as well. And we would be wrong to ignore them. So is rational choice theory above reproach? Is natural selection above reproach? Are these things beyond challenge? My NYU colleague Tom Nagel, who won the Humboldt Award, which is the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in philosophy, wrote a criticism of the district court opinion, which barred the teaching of intelligent design in the public schools of the United States. It was a lower court opinion. It relied on a Supreme Court opinion where I was the lawyer for the prevailing side, which declared unconstitutional as the placing of religion into the public schools, because you can't have in the United States religion in the public schools, okay? By requiring that if you taught evolution, you had to teach creationism. And I argued successfully in the United States that creationism was inherently a religious belief because it went back before the second that astrophysicists study. My provost, who's a great scientist and physicist, once said to me, these astrophysicists spend their entire lives studying 1 second. It's a damn important second. It's the first second, okay? But creationism takes us back before the first second, right? And inherently involves the notion of an interventionist anthropomorphic God. You can't have creationism without that because it's a theory not of development but of beginnings. Tom Nagel said intelligent design, and he's right about this, is not a theory of beginnings. It's a theory of development after the beginning, however that happened. And to bar the teaching of intelligent design, evidence that said maybe there's another explanation other than random selection or natural selection or whatever you want to call it, to do that is making random selection a religion. You may not call it a religion. Many people would not call communism a religion. But I wrote an article about communism as a religion. Okay, so Tom says you can't, in a dialogic world, create any orthodoxy that is beyond reproach. That gets out of the scientific method. Hello, here at UST. Right? And he was pummeled and vilified for writing that by the intelligentsia and the cognoscenti of New York, the readers of the New York Review books. They had unconsciously made a religion out of a particular way. And there's a danger in our disciplines inside the university that we will make certain methodologies sacrosanct. Now, methodologies get belief, they get gravitas, they get acceptance, they're tested by generations, but none of them ever becomes beyond testability. That's the heart of the university. And we have to be careful internally. We have to be careful about the idea of banning certain speakers. Okay? Banning. The solution should be more speech. Okay? Rules, yes. No heckler's veto. No silencing a person by shouting. Okay? But all of these things are important in the traditional university. So I make the argument that universities are the antidote to this secular dogmatism. But then I go beyond that. I'm going to spend just another 7 or 8 minutes going beyond that to be more aggressive. And this in part is, I think, important and relevant to you because of what you as a university are thinking about doing with your joint venture university. So we began to talk earlier about the structure of a 21st century university, not the 21st century university. I want to emphasize that. I said a 21st century university. So I do not envision a world in which there'll be more than a couple of dozen universities of the sort that I described. I expect NYU to be one of them because it's the first case, but who knows? NYU may not see it through. That's not up to me to decide, okay? But I put out the case for leaders in higher education to consider because I think that it's important for the world that a certain type of university go beyond the traditional university. Now, the traditional university is a great item. It's a great thing. There are only 85 institutions in the world that exist today as a formal structural matter the same way they did 500 years ago. And of the 85, like the English Parliament or the Vatican, 70 of the 85 are universities. So this is not to be trifled with. The traditional university is a great thing. And of course, in Hong Kong, you inherit the powerful system where universities like Oxford and Cambridge that are among those 70 are in the background. And those are great traditions, not to be discarded lightly. But I make the argument that there will be some universities that will choose to try to do more to heal the world and move us towards the world that Charlie envisioned and John the 23rd and Teilhard de Chardin envisioned, which is an ecumenical world, a community of communities, okay, where we delighted in the fact that we see difference. We didn't get terrified by it. We didn't start killing each other over it. Okay, and I call that the ecumenical university, secular ecumenism, as a counterpart to what John the 23rd taught with theological ecumenism. So what NYU did was self-consciously attempt to create the first instantation of that. So we started off with New York City. So just visualize. So this is 1.0. So 1.0 is you're a university in New York. You don't have blades of grass. You step out onto the sidewalk. Your buildings aren't next to each other. But you're in a city where if you get on the subway, you can visit every country in the world. So you start doing that. Very simply, we started doing that. 2002, every Saturday, every Sunday, we'd have buses in front of the library, and students could come out and get on a bus and drive to Little Switzerland or Little Chile and walk in, and there was an old-timer, music was playing from the old country, and food was there, and the map was up, and he would talk the language and tell them the history, and, every Saturday, every Sunday, 14 weeks each semester, that's 28 a semester, 56 a year. By the time you were finished with 4 years, you could visit 224 countries. There aren't that many in the world. So you would have visited every country in the world just by getting on a bus. And then we said, wait a minute, let's go to 2.0. So 2.0 was where we said, going to Little Italy is one thing. But those are Italians that have come to New York. They're on our turf. So what if we created a full NYU campus in Italy? And you had residence halls and courses, And it wasn't academic tourism in the traditional study away concept. Okay, it was fully integrated. So you could get organic chemistry there if you were pre-med, or if you were a theater student. We had arrangements with the local theater. It was integrated and approved and run by the departments. Okay, maybe with local professors that were top in their field, who would supplement their positions by teaching at NYU. And you go there for a semester, not for a full degree, a semester. So 2.0, we began to develop what we call study away sites. And we now have 15 study away sites on 6 continents. So you can study, as some students have, if you use a semester, and you can do up to 3 study away semesters. Some students can do up to 5 if they start with their freshman year in one of the study away sites. Okay, so you do 5 different countries, and then we have what we call January term, 3-week, 1 course, and you go into sites for that. So you can visit up to 9 different countries as a student from New York by using the study away sites. And then you begin to develop specialties around the study away sites. So Accra is global public health and the economics of development. Prague is transitional governments and music. Sydney is film and Aboriginal cultures. So you begin to see how you would, right? So then 3.0 happened almost by accident. Okay, and this gets close to what you're thinking about doing. We looked out and we said, we're trying to create the first ecumenical university. Now, these are not satellites, Mr. Chair, and he called them satellites before. He'd only scanned my book. But they're not satellites. They're not branch campuses. You can only go for a semester, okay? They're fully integrated in a circulatory system. You have to think of it as an organic circulatory system. It's almost as if you're moving around buildings on campus, except they're in different countries. And of course, that's the quality control, because the blood is running through the system. Okay, and the faculty's circulating, the students are circulating, and so forth. But we looked out at this and we said, wait a minute, we're not in the Arab or Muslim world. How can you be an ecumenical university and not be in the Arab and Muslim world? So we started, and we looked at 6 places in the Arab and Muslim world, and everybody kept pointing us at Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And finally, I met the leader there, and in an instant, he said, John, I've read your writing about how the world is going to be a set of idea capitals, a premier league of idea capitals. New York, London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and the talent class and the idea class is going to circulate the world. And it's interesting because I had a conversation with Prime Minister Gordon Brown about this once, and he knew a lot about NYU because we're friends going back 25 years. And he knew a lot about it, and he said, this is a great idea you have. And I said, well, it's not that unusual, because universities at the highest level have always operated beyond sovereignty. You think about that, right? Our ideas, especially in science and technology, have always operated beyond sovereignty. And he said, we were up at Checkers, we were having breakfast, and he says, he always had a pen. He said, I'm going to copy that down. He said, I like that, I'm going to use that. I said, Mr. Prime Minister, this is why your polls are in the tank. John, president of a university, okay to say beyond sovereignty. Gordon, head of government, not a good idea to talk about beyond sovereignty. And he said to me, and he taught me, listening. He said, you're wrong. He said, this world, this planetized world, not globalized, people think of that just economic, this planetized, interconnected world that Teilhard writes about, it's going to happen. My job is to make sure London is one of the primary stops in the circulatory system. Your job is to make sure Hong Kong is one of the primary stops. New York for us, and so on, right? And the Crown Prince had gotten that, and he said to me, I want to make sure Abu Dhabi is one of the primary stops. And I don't want to just have a study away site here. I want to build a university that's as good as any in the world. And he said to me, is that possible? And I said, well, nobody's ever tried it. You know, out of whole cloth to start from scratch and build. I said, if you're saying to me I can dream my ideal university and you'll fund it? I said, I'm up for that. And I have to say here, this is right in the last months of my wife's life. And we didn't know they were the last months, but her life was about connecting the unconnected, empowering the unempowered. That was our whole life's work. So when she died, that gave me a little extra impetus to try to represent both of us. And Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed and I began on this enterprise of building a university that was the quintessential ecumenical university. So I just came from the graduation, which is the 6th graduation from NYU Abu Dhabi. Imagine the following. A liberal arts, I'm describing only the undergraduate, a liberal arts tutorial, because the faculty-student ratio is 1:5. My class, which is 20, is a large class. Research university, because there's major doctoral work going on campus and first-order research by faculty that are circling through, including Nobelists and so forth. Research university, education. And that's what created. It's now 1,500 students, undergraduates, 500 doctoral and postdoctoral students, 1,500 students from 144 different countries. The largest contingent is only 15%, 1-5, and they're the Americans, and they're not in their own country. And when they won the World Debate Championships last month, the team consisted of 2 people, an Indian citizen and a Pakistani citizen. And when they won the whole science competition, the team consisted of a Taiwanese, a Chinese, an Indian, and a Pakistani. And they learn this ecumenical way of being in the world. And they enter, and they're all valedictorian level. There's unbelievably strong students. They're a pleasure to teach, so my strongest faculty want to go and circulate through and teach them. And they spend 5 semesters in Abu Dhabi and 3 semesters studying away in the system, and maybe 4 J terms, so that's 7. And because it's government supported, and we have scouts out around the world, literally around the world, in the Masai Mara, in refugee camps and so forth, and we can give kids scholarships that include clothing if necessary and airfare. It's the most diverse student body in the world. About 20% of the students have never been more than 50 miles from home before they get on the plane to come in for the admissions weekend. Nobody's admitted on the paper record. They choose finalists, and then they bring them in, and they go through 2 days of interviews and taking classes and writing exercises. When the Chinese saw what we had done in the first 2 classes at Abu Dhabi, they asked us to do the same thing in Shanghai. The difference between Abu Dhabi and Shanghai is that by mutual agreement, it's a win-win. Half of the students are in NYU Shanghai, half of the undergraduates are Chinese nationals. But you have to be in the top 60,000 on the Gaokao exam to apply to NYU Shanghai, and then you go through a similar process as the Abu Dhabi students. You come in for a day and a half for interviews. And again, it's completely integrated in the circulatory system. So when you go to the Prague study away site, you'll have students coming in from New York, from Abu Dhabi, from Shanghai. And the faculty will be circulating and so forth. So this is the next step in my view. This is now trying to create a cohort of people who've been infected with ecumenism. Right? And so it's more than simply being an antidote to the dumbing down of our politics, but it's a counterpunch. It's something that takes, hopefully, the world a step farther. all of this is to come back to the topic of the day against the tremendous headwinds that are created not by President Trump. This has been a growing phenomenon in the United States over decades. The headwinds of the challenges to thought that are going to permeate the world. Let's hope that there will be parts of the world that will be exceptions to it. And if there are going to be parts of the world, I have hope at least that Hong Kong can be one of the places where thought is valued. Whether you're able here to succeed, I would bet on you. I would bet on you. But you shouldn't take it for granted. And you should remember the teleology of where we're going. Thank you very much for listening. I don't know whether that counts as a lecture or not, but I at least filled enough time that we now can get to the question period that you want. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you again. That was an amazing lecture. I do consider that's a wonderful lecture, and also sharing a lot of insights and enthusiasm and huge passion. Before, I think this is a great opportunity to have leaders of the two wonderful universities in the world. And but before we have this conversation, I would like to thank you all again for joining us, particularly our council chair, Andrew Liao. Thank you very much for. So yeah, why don't you just take some, catch some breath and get some water. Let me just.
Fire when ready.
Let me just let's just straight into this. We're talking about these challenges facing American universities today, and I want to pose my first question to Wei. You have spent so many years in the United States, in Asia, teaching and being the educator and the administrator. My question is, are these questions just talked about, the challenges that John just talked about, just limited to the United States, or this is just a worldwide phenomenon we're all facing, maybe to a different degree? But I would like to hear what you think of all these challenges, particularly in comparing these two different systems.
First of all, I'd like to thank John for taking the time to come to visit HKUST. Okay, when we met this morning, he assured me that actually for today, he has dressed up. Okay, I didn't ask usually what his dress code is, but we certainly appreciate he paid attention to the details. Okay, and I also
He had a tie on this morning.
yes.
So I've already had a bad effect.
We are respectful people. But again, I really appreciate the energy and the enthusiasm and the high value you have placed in all your chat, I would say, okay, conversation. Now, to answer Professor Chia's question, I did spend 30 years in the States before I came here. What John described, certainly I share, and I have a lot of concern myself. And I also feel it is one of the root causes is this unfortunate good intention. Namely, the universities are supposed to be a place which will offer solution to social injustice. And one of the big things in the States in particular is a value for diversity, especially to care for those underprivileged minority. But over the years, it has evolved to the point that this particular cause has prevented many other opinions from being expressed, because otherwise you cannot address the core value adequately. Okay, and when I was in the States, for example, one example is African literature, and there was this big debate for many years about how to teach classic. in the States. Shakespeare, Homer, all these are great work. How about Mexican literature? How about Chinese literature? That's so, actually. Okay, these are predominantly the Western style of the debate. And then the question is, how can we not treat African literature equally? Okay, it is certainly a very sensible idea, but if you have to treat everything exactly on the same footing, it's probably difficult to do it right, considering the vast difference in terms of the volume, not to talk about quality. That's the volume of the work the West has produced over the last several decades compared to, in reality, what's available. Okay? I'm just simply saying this as one of my personal sense concern that for all the good reasons, we kind of force some dialogue to move so much into a particular direction, we won't allow some different opinions, a different approach from being handled. Now, the latest one in the States, I think it's, I would say personally, it's more of a US phenomenon than certainly the Asian phenomenon. I have concern about Asian universities, including ours, but from a somewhat different angle. Okay, in the US, whether John thinks whoever is the president right now, there is a president in the White House, right? And the fact that for whatever reason, if a faculty member cannot even say publicly he or she supports White House person's policy, this person in most places will be castrated. I think that's the most unfortunate development of the U.S. universities. Okay, it's, I fully appreciate the point John was making, namely you have to listen to each other, then deepen the conversation, then to come back. Right now, that doesn't seem to be supported. Okay, in our part of the world, my concern is a little bit different. Namely, we view university too much, perhaps, from a practical, utilitarian kind of angle. We want university to be useful, to support socio-economic development. That interest seems to have outweighed some other fundamental reasons why university exists in the first place. Okay, and we, in fact, unless for some very specific cases, we don't have controversy or even disagreement. Okay, because we don't have enough interest in getting into some of this work. So I think we have problems, but for very different reasons.
Well, thank you very much, Wei. I think that's a very interesting idea. You just mentioned that many of these challenges that we see today was actually started with a good intention. And another point that you just made is this university now bears such a high expectation and responsibilities from by the society, which we're supposed to be a problem solver, and therefore that's why we're spending so much time and working on engineering technologies, addressing all these acute problems now. John, back to you. You're thinking about this Chartist idea of this universities or education, to have this what nowadays we call general education. How would you see this balance between this this general education and also this high expectations from the society?
Well, first, I think when one moves back in the picture, again, I'll use the United States as an example, although I'm sure this is generalizable. the higher education system is like a symphony orchestra. There are various sections of the orchestra, and no one should confuse the brass with the violins, but both are necessary to do Tchaikovsky's Fifth. And as a society in the United States, probably the best statement of it was Clark Kerr's statement for the University of California system, which seems primitive now, 50 years later, but he talked about community colleges, which were highly utilitarian and kind of basic, but still advanced beyond high school. And then there was the comprehensive university, which was different from the research university. And now, you know, we have all kinds of other variations on that theme. You have private and public in the United States. You have faith-based and secular. You have technology being introduced. So all of these different elements are in the picture. And I think the first and most important thing is that each section of the orchestra be required to be intentional about what it's doing and what its goals are. And the balance between utilitarianism on the one hand and, for example, pure research on the other, or it will be different depending upon the university, and we shouldn't allow creep towards a monolithic example. But even at places like NYU and UST, which are advanced research universities, we can't forget the fact that we're existing and supported by a society that requires us to be exercising a certain amount of awareness of where our graduates go. Now, there's a huge argument inside of education about where creativity arises. And the data is fairly interesting. I think the last time I looked, if you looked at the CEOs of the top 50 Fortune 50 companies, more of them were classics majors than were engineers. The Jesuits, by whom I was educated in high school and college, would be horrified if we said that our education prepared us for our first job. They prepared us to think outside of traditional boundaries, informed by a broad education. So what is utilitarian also can depend upon the constituency with which you're dealing. So the single most important thing I would say is, let's not try to make all of our universities do the same thing. And then let's not define what's utilitarian too narrowly. So you take a research university, it's very, very dangerous to gear a research university into a narrow corridor. Okay, probably more creativity and inventions and patents and useful stuff came out of Bell Labs, right? When the mandate simply was send smart people in to play, and they ended up playing and creating great stuff. So you have to be careful about making everybody into a computer scientist, lest you be fighting yesterday's war.
That's the interesting analogy of the university as a symphony orchestra. But there are so many symphony orchestras that there are so many different audience. Some who.
So many. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the university is a section. Particularly, the university is a section in a symphony orchestra, and the system is the symphony orchestra.
Okay, let's say the world is a symphony orchestra, right? We are probably the violin section of that, but the society have different taste. Some want to hear Tchaikovsky, and some want to hear the George Gershwin, and they're very different, right? And there are Boston Pops, there are Berlin the Philharmonic.
Yeah.
I've
never taken this analogy this far, but
right. But I want to follow up on this for both of you. Both the what kind of the music? I mean, when you were serving 14, 15 years as a president of New York University, what kind of what kind of music would you like to play? And do you reflecting back you think that was a successful, I mean, successfully achieved what you have conceived initially?
So it's easy for me to answer, autobiographically for myself at NYU. So I think what a leader in a university does is notice and tell a teleological story. So I think what I did as a leader at NYU, I don't have the right to come in and say, this is the section of the orchestra we will be. We're going to be woodwinds. No. I got to look and I got to see what my musicians are playing and notice aggressively what they're doing. Maybe notice what they could do. I mean, I think university presidents are what I call possibilitarians. They see the possibilities in the constituency and the assets that the community has not yet seen. Yeah, look, there are university presidents who view themselves principally as stewards of a polished franchise. Okay, it's like Rick Levin once brought the Yale Board of Trustees down to NYU when we were just starting the global network, and they spent a day studying what we were doing. And Rick said to me, you've got all your people doing this, you're not speaking. I want you to start the day by explaining the difference between NYU and Yale. And I said, no, Rick, you don't want me to do that. And he said, yes, I do. I know you're going to make a joke of it, but do it. And I used the Zen parable that describes that there are different people in the world. There are people to whom you give your cherished possessions to keep and make sure they're there for future generations, and humidified rooms and so forth and so on. And then there are people you give a block of wood. And I said, that's the difference between Yale and NYU. So I'm talking about block of wood people. My sense is this is a block of wood place. You're aspiring. You're thinking of doing things differently. So for us, you got to look at the assets. In our case, it was very simple. There was this ecosystematic relationship with the world's first ecumenical city. And everything else we did, if you think of what I explained to you, was simply an extrapolation of that. And of course, you notice and you tell a story. But if nobody's listening to your story, you tell it 5 or 6 times and nobody's listening, it doesn't resonate, you start telling another story, or you go back to your classroom, and stop being president. But you don't have the right to say, this is what we're going to be, nor is that going to be effective. So my sense is you have to look at, you're in a unique city and you have a unique station. So you start off with certain unique assets, and then as a community, his task is to notice and put on offer a story. It's not commanding, it's putting it on offer, and then you hope people respond. And if they respond, it's a success. If they don't respond, and people at NYU responded over that 15 years. And we never took a vote, but many more people wanted to be involved than could be involved. And that I declare that a success, and it certainly was recognized, and the results seem to be successful. So it's worth 15 years of my life. But,
well, comparing NYU and Yale, probably harder, but comparing NYU and UST, it's probably easier, right? We don't have a Washington Square, but we have a piazza here.
Yeah.
And we have a little bit of blazer grass. But we have more forest, oceans, mountains.
Yeah.
This
and aspiration
landscape, right? But the kind of idea of building a community of a community, that in that sense, we're very different. We're very, very different. But yet, UST has been very successful in building its own reputation and its own contribution to the world. The way, probably this is just back to that kind of music to play. And how would you compare us, looking into the future, right? Responding to these challenges facing the universities today?
I think there are 2 aspects, at least, I would like to highlight. First of all, that is, we're 28 years old, and overall, I take pride in seeing this place I am, thanks to the founding members of this university, and many of them are still here, carry on the baton and continue our mission. So we certainly have some success, which we can claim and state, correctly so. But I think to us, we certainly have to be mindful in terms of how to project into the future, right? Hong Kong is a very rich and highly exceptional setting globally. I think we certainly want to take advantage of the openness and international kind of opportunity. We also need to offer better preparation and engagement opportunities to the members. And that's part of the reason why we figured we should take a step to be more aggressively to set up a new campus. That is fundamental to our future self-expectation, because we need to identify more partners and more of the advanced frontier science, technology, and business opportunities. So our students, our faculty, alumni, in fact, can all have a chance to be better supported and more engaged. That's one part. Having said that, I also feel that I hope not all the universities will try to do the same thing, not because we don't want anybody else to do what we do. We just come back to this need for diversity. This is actually probably related to your symphony orchestra kind of analogy. We may do this by playing bassoon. Somebody else needs to play trumpet. And another one may play drum. So if everybody plays the same instrument, it would be very boring, right? And that is what I feel universities here, in particular, should spread out, have different kind of interest angle to approach based on one's own charter and situation. Okay. My concern about where we are in this region is all the universities virtually practically want to have the same kind of position, if not better, with some very narrow matrix, ranking in particular. Okay. I think this is one aspect I feel we do need to have a little bit more self-confidence and broader outlook.
So I understand, again, back to the symphony orchestra now, in between this, the campus on Clearwater Bay and campus in Guangzhou, there is a design that they are going to be same quality, but really different foci. Understand there are 10 thrust areas in Guangzhou. There will be no duplicating between these two campuses. The different way of different way of playing it, the different roles. John, you started this idea of building this global network universities, and you have been very successful to set up the NYU Abu Dhabi and NYU Shanghai. And just looking ahead, I guess all of us here would like to hear from you, your advice on developing this new campus that the UST is building in Guangzhou, and particularly, some of the mistakes that you think you have made, and probably we can learn from that, right?
Well, first and most importantly, you've got to make sure you have the right partner. And you've got to make sure that you and your partner are aligned in your objectives. So I think it's important to spend a lot of time vetting out core issues. Now, that requires you to think, what are your core issues? So for us, it was a sine qua non. Now, I want to make it very clear. 2.0, which was the study away sites, was in a way easy, because that was just locating ourselves. Okay, there was no partner in a way. We were using the existing local assets. So, for example, I remember sitting down in the London study away site with 3 students who obviously were from New York because it was prior to Abu Dhabi and Shanghai, and saying to them, why would you ever come to London to study away? It's New York City with an accent. Why wouldn't you go to Accra or to Buenos Aires? And they answered organic chemistry. They were pre-med, and they said organic chemistry. I said, what? This was a real revelation for me. They said, well, in New York, if we took organic chemistry, which is key for pre-med majors, we'd be in a class of 400, and we'd break down into 20 sections of 20 with a doctoral student as our lab instructor. Here, you folks have hired the top organic chemist at University College London, and there are only 12 of us in the class, and he's teaching us, and he's our lab instructor. So we're much better off. The next time I saw those 3 students was on the streets of Pennsylvania. They had all gotten into University of Pennsylvania Medical School. So they were pretty clever about getting by organic chemistry. You're not doing that. You're doing what we did in Abu Dhabi and in Shanghai. And there you start with the partner. And for us, there were a set of things that were core, such as control of the curriculum, control over faculty appointments, academic freedom on campus. And we worked hard at understanding what those words meant because we didn't count on the fact that our partners had a complete understanding of them. I would think that it's a little different for you, but you have to figure out what your core notions are. So if there's a sense, you said something I wasn't aware of, that there won't be any duplication in the 2 campuses. Well, on the streets of Brooklyn, we always try to put ourselves in the other person's mind. If I'm your partner, and you've got a great department in X, one of the reasons I may want to be your partner is to have a piece of the action in that department. So I would work out with your partner what it means that there won't be duplication. Can N number of their students come here for that? Will there be that kind of circulation? I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer. I'm just saying make sure there's no misunderstanding going in with your partner. Another thing that becomes really important, right, is are there going to be enough resources, financial resources in particular, to do it at a level of excellence that satisfies you? In my experience, 95% of the people that offer themselves as partners in this context don't understand the magnitude of the investment that's necessary. In fact, a lot of them, not so much in China, but in India, for example, come with a business model that has a rate of return of 9% coming back to them at some point down the investment line. That's a poison pill, as far as I'm concerned. When the ruler in Abu Dhabi asked me when we would know we were a success, I said, when you are losing large amounts of money. Because that, I mean, think of it. Think of what we do. We're the only business that I can think of that literally not only gives away our best product for free, but pays people to take it. Right? We give stipends to PhD students and free tuition. It's our best product. And we pay them to take it. Nobody does that in a business model. But I wanted to make sure that His Highness understood that. So you've got to just figure out what are your core elements, and you've got to say, where is it likely my counterparty is going to misunderstand, not ill-intentioned, but is going to misunderstand something that's bedrock for me, and get that cleared up as early as you can.
Well, thank you. I think probably it's time for us to open the floor for your questions, your input. So raise your hand, and we'll get the microphone to you. Make sure to identify yourself before, Donald here.
Thank you, Professor Sexton. I'm Donald. I look after the Leadership and Public Policy program. Thanks very much for that inspiring talk. I want to pick up on your point about secular ecumenism, which I interpret to mean radical inclusivism. And my pushback, my just to play the devil's advocate, my reaction is it's not easy for university professors to be that inclusive. I mean, we tend to be people with strong priors, strong, sometimes ideological positions. So it's one thing to have ecumenical platforms and avenues for students to engage and to debate. It's quite another for us to do it with colleagues. If my department were to hire a Trump voting American, I think I would have serious problems being good colleagues with him, much less having a sustained debate, a sustained civil, meaningful debate. So based on your experience at NYU, how do you create the sort of organizational values, culture that embrace, that welcome this sort of radical inclusivism, this embrace this diversity? Thank you.
Well, that is a great question, and I took Wei's point about Trump earlier, and in a way you've given me an opportunity to clarify my position, which would be that if the young Republicans or the student Republicans invited President Trump to campus, clearly he should come to campus. If somebody said to me, would you give an honorary degree to Trump? I wouldn't, okay? And there are different ways of inclusion or non-inclusion. And as you may have witnessed, and it comes directly to your point, I think, and on this I have to say, my position is not only a minority and highly eccentric position, but it even differs from my very, very good successor, Andy Hamilton. I feel so strongly about creating what I call a sacred space for dialogue on campus that I think that a dean or a university president, the person in charge of a particular unit or the university, loses rights of political expression upon accepting that position. So I had to, notwithstanding the fact I have very strong political views and might be called by some a political activist, for 28 years I maintained a vow of silence with regard to any issue that was not directly in the province of the dean or the president. Fighting for financial aid for students, fighting for affirmative action, those are in the province. But my position on the death penalty, the Iraq war, who should be president, because I think that the sacred space is so important that people in our position have to maintain a detachment from the debate in order, when in the moment comes when you have to exercise moral authority, people don't think you're on one side or the other, or that you're making a habit of using the forum as your own bully pulpit. My experience is with colleagues that they're, by and large, and maybe this is because I come from the law school principally, that by and large, they're very good at debate within their disciplines. When they get outside their disciplines, they suffer from some of the infirmities that the general public does. I had, of my 28 years, the 14 as dean were uniformly highly pleasant. The 14 as president were, with the exception of 2, highly pleasant. Years 11 and 12 were difficult. Interesting, not over something that had to do with the curriculum, but had to do with the fact that we got from the city of New York an upzoning which allowed us to build 2 million square feet on property that we owned, which was a gym. Now, just to give you some sense of the value of that, that meant the city of New York was giving us something worth $5 billion. Okay, the NYU's endowment is less than $5 billion. This was a gift from the city of a building right, not an obligation to build, a building right. My economics department, which had in it 4 people who received the Nobel in economics within the last 15 years, sent me a protest letter about the building project that started by saying you're going to bankrupt the university and drive up tuition. It was nonsensical, but the building was adjacent to where faculty live. So they had lost their perspective, and it took 18 months and a faculty committee to start a report that was 85 pages that unanimously endorsed what we did with the sentence, It took us 18 months to realize it's cheaper to build on land you own than land you don't own. Now, you would have thought that 4 Nobelists in economics would have understood that. But when they moved outside of their discipline, and it had to do with the disruption of construction next to their home, they became general citizens. Look, I'm a great believer, this gets back to my doctorate in religion, I'm a great believer in naming and, if necessary, shaming. And I think if we name the issue, if we say the sacred space for dialogue has to be preserved by all of us, that we have to become more intentional about it, that this is important to the essence and future of the university. It's also important as a collateral to the future of society. But let's get our own house in order, right? And let's be a little bit more self-conscious. I mean, even as you ask your question, there's the implication that maybe our colloquy today has raised your own consciousness, and maybe next time you'll take a breath and listen a little bit more and engage, and step by step.
I totally agree with John's point in terms of allowing different views to be exchanged and debated. For Donald's question, I think we need to be very mindful that since by definition, university is an open vessel to not only allow, but to promote different ideas to be brought up. In the form of Trump, we liked him or not, he was elected. We can debate the U.S. voting system, whatever, but that's not the issue. If there are people, so many of them who voted for him, and we say that doesn't deserve to be heard, I think we are ruling a very big fraction of people out. On the other hand, if hardly anybody voted for him, took the other extreme as an example, there's just no harm for anybody to say who want to support him, right? So either way, I don't think that gives us a right or justification, right? I think there's this old saying that I do not agree with anything you said. On the other hand, I will fight to protect your right to say whatever you want to say. These are two very important principles. I don't have to agree because I have my own reasoning, but that doesn't diminish your right. I think university is the last place for us to lose that perspective. Okay, that's very, very important. If I may, I'd like to, since maybe not all of our, members here know some of the points that John raised about our new campus, I'd just like to take a couple of minutes to explain to John and maybe to some of the especially students here. We made a very conscious decision to make the new campus different. Because there are a couple of reasons. First of all, we don't develop a new campus because we want to recruit more students. That's not our motivation. We will have more students, but if I want to do physics, we will do physics here as a degree program. We want to go to the new campus to offer new degree programs that we don't offer here, which will be better for both campuses. Because the new degree program that we are planning to offer are all cross schools, actually not even just cross department. So these will be truly cross-disciplinary in nature, that we don't really have the capacity or readiness to offer. Secondly, maybe even more important, at least in my mind, is the cross-disciplinary approach are easier said than done. We can talk about whatever big topics we talk about. We can have an institute of X, Y, Z. Under each institute, there are all legacy programs and the units. You just cannot move them. Even a young university like ours, we have the same similar issues. So what we would do in the new campus is to have a new academic structure. We will not only do it without duplicating the degree programs, we will be there without duplicating any of our departments and schools, in fact. Okay, so we will have a brand new campus which will offer degree programs fully complementary to what we do here. And one thing that I think we are quite exceptionally fortunate is our new campus is a short train ride away from here. So it is natural not only to circulate, it's natural to come back and forth every day, okay, physically, because it is only a few minutes away from our West Kowloon train station. Okay, our new campus was explicitly requested by us to be next to the newest Guangzhou South high-speed train station, and that was a very important reason. So by having a set of new degree programs and a very different academic structures in the form of department, thrust areas, and schools, I think we have a chance to really learn from each other to see how can we do this new, truly cross-disciplinary endeavor, hopefully with more open-mindedness. Then we can learn from each other. And for the foundational study, since the two campuses are quite within reach, with MOOCs, many other things, our design is students on both campuses will be supported to learn courses from both campuses. Furthermore, we would like to see, beyond just taking courses or having experience, we like to see many students, especially on the new campus, to be able to earn 2 degrees, both from HKUST, but in 2 different subject areas. One from the new campus, one from Curriculum Bay, because they can support each other. For example, we are going to offer a degree program in artificial intelligence. This is not just computer science, as we know. It is certainly every bit as mathematics, business school, even our social science in terms of quantitative analysis, right? But the domain application can be genomics, can be materials, can be many other things. So students will really be supporting a much broader way that we cannot do right now. And the last thing that we do differently, certainly initially, is we will only offer graduate program. For the first several years, we will not offer undergraduate. And again, since these are so new, I feel we need to really experiment, figure out how to do that at the graduate level before we worry about how do we balance general education, whole person, then foundation, then on top of all these brand new topics. Okay, so that is why I just like to explain to ourselves why we are doing this.
Could I comment on that?
Yeah, I was just about to ask you your comments.
So
Right.
First of all, I'm glad you added that, because you've taught me much more than I knew before, and I just have one word, and that is brilliant. And I can tell you, based upon some of the things that have happened as NYU has developed the Global Network University, and I'll give you just 2 concrete examples. The simplest one, which is quite analogous to what you've just described, is that we've developed a campus in Brooklyn, which is literally a 10-minute subway ride from Washington Square, and we used roughly 1 million square feet that we developed in Brooklyn when we brought engineering back into NYU. We decided that we didn't just want to bring engineering back. We had been operating without engineering, and we said our science needs engineering. But when we bring engineering back, we want engineering to be working with the dental school, the medical school, et cetera, even with the law school on cybersecurity, for example. So engineering became a hub, but then we gave them 1 million square feet more, and all of a sudden that space, because space is of such a premium in New York City as it is here, that space became a magnet, but we used as a criteria that only if 3 or 4 schools would, so around gaming and education, we have the Tisch School of the Arts, we have the School of Education, we have the engineers, the mathematicians, and that's been a huge success, exactly along the lines that you say. The other really dramatic example was NYU Abu Dhabi, because there we were completely tabula rasa. So every program could be developed on a new. So, for example, and this is undergraduate, I'll admit, but our scientists decided that they would create a 1.5 year long unified science course that didn't use the traditional divisions among physics, chemistry, and biology, but rather taught foundations of science as a generic thing, along with calculus and so forth. And what happens with these programs, and this happens all the time in Abu Dhabi, is, so I used to say, because NYU before 2000 was essentially a federation, that if humankind has thought of an activity, and it's not veterinary medicine, which is the only one I can't say, NYU has a degree granting program in it. We probably have 2 at least. And the question is, do they know of each other's existence, let alone do they cooperate? And so it's kind of a metaphor for New York City. So, for example, if you go to Broadway, chances are, if you look at the cast bios, you'll see 1/3 of the class will have NYU degrees. But you would assume maybe they were from the Tisch School of the Arts, but they also could be from the completely independent music program in Steinhardt, okay, which is a whole different, and one's a conservatory model, the other's, I could not get them because of the legacy interests, even to cross-list each other. We had 2 programs in music business, and I couldn't get them to cross-list their courses. But you send them to Abu Dhabi, and they find out that the other people don't have viruses. In fact, they're actually healthy, good partners, and then what happens is that will refract back. So there's a lot of gold in the hills you're mining, and it's an absolutely brilliant plan, especially with the proximity.
Very good. There are a lot to learn from each other. Maybe I have time for one last question, please. Yes, the girl over there.
Not girl, professor.
Oh.
Hi, my name is Eva Chen, and I'm from the Division of Social Science. I really appreciate John's talk today, as well as the conversation between John and Wei. So my question is actually also about the ecumenical ideal, which is an ideal that I think, that I very much appreciate and I also support. My question, though, is ideas are often not equal. And the reason why ideas are not equal is because the people who hold these ideas, they come from groups that are not necessarily equal, right? So I think then it becomes, when you're talking about the sacred space of conversation, I think the question is, how do we preserve the value of ideas when they might threaten the well-being of people from other groups? And I think this is a question, this is a challenge that I think actually does face American universities today, right? There are these conversations about what happens when students are special snowflakes, and I'm troubled by that kind of conversation, because I think there has to be recognition, right? That without mentioning specific people now, right? But if I am a white person and I have this idea that there's a superiority in my race, right? This is an idea, and it might be an idea that is rooted in the community I'm from. But this is an idea that is very likely to be threatening to members of my university community who might be from other racial groups. And I understand your point to Donald's question that I think faculty, to some extent, we need to step away from these conversations. But I also wonder if there's a way that we can guide these conversations so that they're fruitful. Because I think one of the big challenges, right, is listening, right? I think that's step 0.0, is how do you get people to listen, especially people who are from dominant, more privileged groups, for them to recognize their position of privilege, for them to recognize that maybe some of their thoughts can have serious implications, because life is not like a very formal debate. It might have serious implications for people from other groups. And how do you then move not just from a position of diversity, but to a position of actual inclusion, of having everyone feel included and welcomed in the university community?
So this year in the Emirates is the year of tolerance. And it's been very interesting as I've gone through that exercise with the leadership there. For me, I don't speak or read Arabic, but to learn that the Arabic word for tolerance has a very different meaning from the English word for tolerance, which in the United States, when we speak about tolerance, it's "I'll put up with you." Yeah. Whereas in Arabic, it's much more, "I will delight in your presence." And of course, that's the move we want to make here. I talk in the book a good bit about this, and I'll if you just bear with me, I'll give you. So in the conversation about diversity that goes on in the United States, and by the way, it's very interesting for me because I'm every 2 weeks over in Abu Dhabi with my students to find out how limited they find the conversation about diversity in the United States, because it's a very narrow band as it goes on. But even in the United States, in that narrow band, I think what we have to do is raise the sensitivity of people who traditionally have been empowered in conversations, who've had voice, that there is an act of trust being made by those who traditionally have not had voice when they say to us, "When you do this, you hurt me." Because in a way, they're weaponizing us. They're telling us how we can hurt them most deeply. And that creates a real moral call for silence and a real attempt and when you get into the advanced theology, I remember my book is a metaphor, and the good news, the conclusion is called Being Worthy of Lisa, and effectively goes back to Lisa and says, she said, "Go tilt the windmills, because if no one tilts them, they're not going to fall. If we don't fight the good fight, so go against the headwinds, right? Don't be afraid to fail at it, because we have to fight in order to do it." So I think we have to name this phenomena and call upon people to get them into dialogue. And what makes me optimistic is that over the 60-year arc, we've succeeded in creating a meaningful conversation theologically. And if we've done it in the area of theology, if there's genuine dialogic dialogue going on in the area of theology, we ought to be able to do it in the area of politics. I mean, it's but what it requires is a genuine interest in this sense of affirmative tolerance that requires those that traditionally have dominated the conversational space to understand their power and remain silent, and try not just remain silent until the other person stops and then you start talking, but remain silent and aggressively try to get into that person's space to understand A, where they are, and B, how they see us. We're not, unless we name it, we're not going to be able to do it. Now, two quick examples, one very quick and the other just an anecdote from one of these NPR shows, which was very instructive to me. So I have had a lot of success in talking to people about this, to use an oral argument before the Supreme Court of the United States as an analogy. Because it turns out I used to use this with my debaters. If I'm making an argument for the Supreme Court of the United States, typically I know I've got these votes against me over here and these votes against me here, and this is the key judge. And I'm going to assume for the best of motives, just different doctrinal. But I know that Anthony Kennedy or John Roberts is the judge I've got to get if I'm going to get 5. That's the magic number. And I will I will accept the burden of causing that person to hear me. And when my debaters used to come to me and say, "We made that argument," I said, no, your duty is to have the judge hear your argument. So any good teacher actually does this. I teach the same syllabus in New York, Abu Dhabi, and Shanghai. In New York, where 75% of my students are American. In Shanghai, where 50% of them are Chinese. In Abu Dhabi, where they're from 18 different countries, 20 students. When you're teaching about religion and government, you have to teach differently not because of restrictions on academic freedom, but because your students are different. Any good teacher does that. So adapting your persuasive skills, okay, is part of this dialogue, and part of that is understanding where your partner is. Final anecdote on this, because it's just too good to pass up in this context. So my first question on NPR was from Luke from Wisconsin. And Luke calls up, you know, I've done 20 minutes with the host of the stuff we've been discussing, and Luke calls up and says, the last place I would ever look is your universities, and I'm reading all this stuff about you have to call students by certain pronouns, and some want to be called them, and some that are men want to be called she, and some that are women want, there are 8 different pronouns, and if there's anything that ever, shows that the university's been taken over by the left, this is it. And the host turns and said, respond, right? So he wanted a binary conversation right away. And I said, no, I'd like to ask Luke a question. I said, Luke, let's say you and I are sitting down in a cafeteria to have a conversation. And I say to you, Luke, I'd prefer you if you call me by my last name. Would you insist on calling me by my first name? He says, of course not. He says, basic courtesy. I said, okay. And if I said to you, with the security guards at NYU, for my first year as president, I couldn't get these security guards at NYU, they train, military, police, that kind of thing, to call me anything other than Sir, Doctor, or Dr. Sexton. And I would say to them, my students call me John. I want you to call me John. Finally, I figured out how to get them. I said, why do you insist on calling me Sir or Dr. Sexton? Out of respect. I said, why don't you respect my request? If you really respect me, respect my request. So I said, so Luke, if you insist on calling me she, I said, in the playgrounds in Brooklyn, I might clock you. Luke said, oh, now I understand. Okay, it's simply a respect in the conversation. Now, I'm not saying everybody's a Luke or whatever, but we can create genuine dialogue, and an important part of that dialogue is the point you raise, that those of us that traditionally have been blessed with having space have got to say. Now, on the other hand, it can't be either of two things. It can't be, like I tell my students, they're not entitled to an opinion in my class. Okay? That's your opinion. That's my opinion. The earth is flat. No, you're entitled to a viewpoint. The difference between a viewpoint and an opinion is a viewpoint's backed up by reasoning. An opinion is a gut. Okay, so we're not into relativism where all ideas are the same. Let's extend the argument. So there's not this. I'm not a deconstructionist. Okay, and it can't simply be. I was at Harvard Law School when Roberta Unger and Duncan Kennedy and Morty Horowitz created. They took Derrida and brought him to law, and we would spend a whole year analyzing cases into no meaning at all. Okay, it's called critical legal studies, and I would say to them, it is not revelatory to me. I came here with a PhD in religion. I've read the Bhagavad Gita. I've read. It's not revelatory that Western objectivism does not capture all of reality. Thank you very much for that. But that's a very good first negative. So I'm not surprised that American law favors rich white men because it was written by rich white men. But the answer to that is not, okay, so now give poor black women the right to have absolute power for a century. We got to get to a second affirmative where we're trying to build it's not just a power shift either. So in my experience, these things can be discussed.
Sure. So, where you get the final word.
I just like to add, I think
Right.
Eva's question is a very important one in my view. I agree with pretty much what John just said. I just like to add that, first of all, we do need to recognize that there are many different views. They need to be seriously presented. It's not just for the sake of saying anything because I have a right. But I also would like to separate your viewpoint versus policy and framework. Everybody can say and should be allowed and supported to one's view, but that does not mean in terms of overall collective framework, we will do anything just because somebody has said something. So these are two very different venues. One is we certainly support, in fact, encourage all members to speak. Secondly, we have to regulate and direct traffic so that whatever action we take, we support the first part. And we also cannot ignore the fact that a lot of current disagreement, if you will, in part result from certain group of people feel they were not given the right they deserve. And I think there is some truth to that both ways. So I think what we are trying to say, I believe we are pretty consistent in this, is we are here to certainly to support the notion that university should give everybody that opportunity to speak, to listen. Then to debate, I certainly would like to see more of that on our own campus, right? Then to iterate. That, I think, will make all of us better.
Well, thank you very much. That concludes the this part of the conversation. And for more of this kind of conversation, I'm sure you can find out from National Public Radio website. And even better, get your own copy of the book, Standing for Reason and the University in a Dogmatic Age. By
All the proceeds go to
Sexton.
financial aid for students.
Well, all proceeds goes to financial aid for students, even better. And please.
So we are not paying John honorarium at all. He's coming here for free.
All right.
Just want to make that statement.
But that and the other reasons, we want to you all to join me to thank our speakers, both speakers. Thank you so much. Thank you.